The secret, she whispered to the crimson roses, is knowing that everything living wants to flourish. You just have to listen to what it needs. The roses seemed to lean toward her voice, their petals unfurling wider in the golden light. Gerda smiled, brushing dirt from her apron as footsteps approached across the courtyard. Still talking to flowers like they're people? Kay's voice carried its familiar teasing warmth as he dropped down beside her, his dark hair falling across his forehead in the way that made the village girl sigh. But Kay had eyes only for books and grand adventures, dismissing romance as sentimental nonsense, better suited to fairy tales. They listen better than most people, Gerda replied, settling back on her heels. And they never interrupt when I'm trying to explain something important. Kay laughed, that bright sound that had been the soundtrack to their childhood. They had grown up in neighboring houses, sharing secrets, adventures, and dreams. While other children played with wooden toys, they had explored every corner of their small mountain village, Kay spinning elaborate tales of distant kingdoms, while Gerda wove flower crowns and taught him the names of every growing thing. Speaking of important things, Kay said, his tone shifting to the serious register he used when discussing his academic pursuits. Professor Linevis says I'm ready for the advanced mathematics course at the university. I could leave for the capital as early as next month. Something cold touched Gerda's heart, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. That's wonderful, Kay. You've worked so hard for this opportunity. Come with me, he said suddenly, reaching for her hand. The city has libraries that would make your head spin, and botanical gardens with plants from every corner of the world. Think of what you could learn there. Gerda looked down at their intertwined fingers, his pale and soft from hours spent with pen and paper, hers earth-stained and calloused from garden work. My place is here with grandmother. She needs me, and the gardens need tending. The gardens, Kay said with slight exasperation, will survive without you for a few seasons. This is our chance to see the world beyond these mountains. Before Gerda could respond, the air around them began to shimmer with an unnatural chill. The roses in her hands frosted over instantly, their petals turning crystalline and sharp. Both children looked up to see snowflakes falling from a clear blue sky, each flake large and perfect and wrong for the warm autumn day. How strange, Gerda murmured, but Kay had gone perfectly still beside her. The snowflakes swirled faster, forming intricate patterns in the air before one, larger and more elaborate than the others, drifted directly toward Kay's face. Gerda reached out to brush it away, some instinct warning her of danger, but she was too late. The snowflake touched Kay's cheek and seemed to melt directly into his skin. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Kay blinked, and when he looked at her again, his eyes held the flat, reflective quality of ice. Actually, he said, his voice carrying a new, cruel edge, I think I prefer to make this journey alone. You'd only hold me back with your rustic concerns. The change was so sudden, so complete, that Gerda felt as though she'd been slapped. Hey, what? Look at yourself, he continued, standing and brushing dirt from his clothes with obvious distaste. Covered in soil, talking to plants, content to waste your life in this backwards village. I need companions who can match my intellect, not someone who thinks gardening is a suitable ambition. Each word hit Gerda like a physical blow. This wasn't her Kay, her kind, dreamy Kay who had spent countless hours listening to her explain the mysteries of root systems and seasonal cycles. This stranger wore Kay's face, but spoke with the voice of winter itself. You don't mean that, she whispered, but Kay was already walking away. I'll be leaving tomorrow, he called over his shoulder. Perhaps it's better this way. I was outgrowing our friendship anyway. Gerda remained kneeling among the frozen roses long after Kay's footsteps faded, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The impossible snow had stopped falling, but the chill remained in her bones. She touched one of the crystallized roses, and it crumbled to glittering dust between her fingers. That night, unable to sleep, Gerda stood at her bedroom window and watched a magnificent sleigh pulled by white horses glide silently down from the mountains. Even from a distance, she could see the figure seated beside the driver, Kay, though he sat rigid and still as a statue. The woman holding the reins was beautiful in the way that winter storms were beautiful, terrible and overwhelming and ultimately destructive. The Snow Queen. Gerda had heard the old stories, The warnings passed down through generations about the ice which you stole away clever young men and froze their hearts until they forgot everything they had ever loved. As the sleigh disappeared into the northern darkness, Gerda made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. She would follow them. She would journey to the Snow Queen's palace and bring Kay home, no matter what it cost her. Her grandmother tried to dissuade her, citing the dangers of the frozen wastes and the Queen's terrible power. But Gerda had advantages that the old woman didn't fully understand. The gift that made flowers bloom and seeds sprout was connected to something far older and more powerful than simple gardening skills. It was life magic, the force that opposed winter's eternal sleep. "Promise me you'll be careful," her grandmother said, pressing a small seed into Gerda's palm as she prepared to leave. "This contains the essence of summer itself. Plant it only in your hour of greatest need." Gerda's journey north took her through landscapes increasingly touched by unnatural winter. She walked for days through snow that should not have existed, following the sleigh's tracks and the strange, crystalline flowers that bloomed in its wake, beautiful but lifeless, like everything the Snow Queen touched. In a forest of ice-covered trees, she met a band of robbers who had heard tales of the Snow Queen's latest prize. A young man with dark hair and clever eyes, their leader confirmed, saw them pass 3 days ago. The boy looked like he was carved from marble, beautiful but cold as death. The robber chief's daughter, moved by Gerda's tears, gave her warm furs and provisions for the journey ahead. "Your love for your friend burns brighter than any fire," the girl said. "Perhaps it will be enough to melt what the Queen has frozen." Days blended into one another as Gerda pressed northward. The landscape became increasingly surreal. Palaces of ice that appeared and vanished like mirages, aurora lights that danced in impossible colors, and always the bone-deep cold that tried to convince her to give up and sleep forever in the snow. But Gerda carried summer within her heart. When the cold grew too fierce, she would cup her hands around a handful of snow and whisper to it as she did to her flowers, coaxing warmth from her very soul until the ice melted and steam rose between her fingers. When food ran short, she would find winter berries and encourage them to ripen with her touch, filling herself with their concentrated sunshine. The Snow Queen's palace rose before her like a mountain of crystal and starlight, its spires reaching impossible heights into the aurora-painted sky. Guards of living ice blocked the gates, but they were creatures of winter, and Gerda's life magic flowed around them like warm water, causing them to weep themselves into puddles. Inside the palace, everything was beautiful and terrible and empty. Halls stretched for miles, filled with frozen fountains and ice sculptures of creatures that might once have been alive. The only sounds were Gerda's footsteps and the distant howling of wind through crystal chambers. She found Kay in the Queen's throne room, kneeling on the floor before a massive mirror made of black ice. His fingers worked constantly at arranging ice crystals into patterns, his movements precise but mechanical. He had grown thin during his captivity, his skin pale as porcelain, but his eyes were the worst part, empty of everything that had made him Kay. "The word is eternity," he murmured to himself, moving the crystals with increasingly frantic motions. "If I can spell eternity, she promised I could leave. But the pieces, they won't fit properly." "Kay," Gerda whispered, and he looked up with no recognition in his frozen gaze. "Do I know you?" His voice carried the same cruel indifference he had shown in the garden, but now it seemed mechanical, as if someone else were speaking through his lips. Before Gerda could answer, the air filled with the sound of breaking glass, and the Snow Queen materialized from the shadows. She was magnificent and horrible, her beauty sharp enough to cut, her presence filling the vast room with killing cold. "Another village girl come to play the hero," the Queen said, her voice like wind across glaciers. "How tedious. Kay, dispose of this interruption, so you can return to your task." Kay stood obediently, ice crystals forming in his palms, but Gerda stepped forward without fear. All her life, she had been called simple, provincial, limited by her attachment to growing things in quiet places. But standing in this palace of eternal winter, she finally understood the true scope of her power. "You made a mistake," she told the Snow Queen, her voice steady despite the cold that tried to freeze the words in her throat. "You chose Kay because he was clever, because his mind could grasp complex patterns and abstract concepts. But you never understood what made him truly special. The queen's laugh sounded like icicles breaking. And what might that be, little gardener? His capacity for love, Gerda said simply. His ability to see beauty in small things. His kindness. You froze his heart, but you couldn't destroy it completely. You could only bury it deeper. She knelt beside Kay, ignoring the ice crystals that cut her knees, and pulled out her grandmother's seed. As she pressed it into the frozen floor, she began to speak, not to the queen or even to Kay, but to the life force that connected all growing things. I call upon summer, she whispered, and the sea began to glow with warm golden light. I call upon spring rains and autumn harvests. I call upon every flower that ever bloomed, every tree that ever grew, every blade of grass that ever reached toward the sun. The light spread outward from the seed, and where it touched, ice began to crack and melt. The Snow Queen shrieked and raised her hands, sending waves of freezing wind toward Gerda, but the life magic had awakened something that winter could not touch. Kay's ice crystals scattered as he pressed his hands to his chest, his face contorting with sudden pain. The mirror behind him began to fracture, showing not reflections but glimpses of summer days, children playing in meadows, lovers walking through blooming gardens, families gathered around harvest tables. Kay, Gerda said again, and this time her voice reached him through the layers of ice around his heart. Remember the roses. Remember how we used to watch them bloom. Tears began to flow down Kay's cheeks, the first warm thing in the Snow Queen's palace in centuries. As they fell, they melted the remaining ice crystals at his feet, and suddenly he could see clearly again. Gerda! His voice cracked with wonder and shame. What have I done? What did I say to you? Nothing that wasn't the Queen's magic speaking, Gerda replied, helping him to his feet. Around them, the palace groaned and shifted as her summer magic continued to spread through its foundations. The Snow Queen made one final attempt to reclaim her prize, lunging toward them with hands like frozen claws, but the spreading warmth drove her back. Where Gerda's magic touched her, the queen began to diminish, becoming translucent as melting ice. This is not finished, she hissed as she faded. Winter always returns. Yes, Gerda agreed peacefully, but so does spring. Hand in hand, they walked from the collapsing palace as it transformed around them, ice becoming water, water becoming mist, mist becoming the first warm breeze either of them had felt in months. The journey home took weeks, but every step carried them further from winter's grip and closer to the life they had shared. Kay never forgot the lessons learned in his captivity. His pursuit of knowledge became tempered with wisdom, his ambitions balanced by understanding of what truly mattered. He did eventually attend university, but he returned every summer to tend the gardens with Gerda, their friendship now deepened by the knowledge that love, not magic, had ultimately saved them both. And in the courtyard where their adventure began, the roses bloomed more beautifully than ever before, as if they, too, remembered the power of warmth returning after the longest, coldest night.